Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody who has joined us here today for this seminar. My name is Patrick French. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. And we are really super pleased that Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr is our speaker today on a vitally important subject, the importance of non-Western philosophy, with a particular focus on Islamic philosophy. And as a kind of mark of acknowledgement, we've had close on 800 or 900 registrations for today's seminar. And some people are in the room, the Zoom room, and others are going to be watching remotely using a YouTube live link. We will have a formal introduction in a moment from one of our students, Hadi Talwani, but I just wanted to mention one thing, which is that the study of philosophy in the broadest sense is one of our ambitions at Ahmedabad University School of Arts and Sciences. So although we're very new, we're only nearly 4 years old, we have really got some remarkable philosophers in different philosophical traditions. And we have a major called Philosophy, History and Languages, which seeks to link up the study of languages, Sanskrit, Urdu, Persian, and in time, more South Asian and West Asian languages, with the history of those traditions and the study of philosophy itself. The only other thing I wanted to mention before we begin is that this is a time of great suffering from the pandemic all around the world. And in Ahmedabad itself and in other parts of India, this is something that is very, very difficult that we're all having to pass through. And I just wanted to acknowledge that at a time when we were all meeting together. So I'll now hand over to Hadi Talwani, who in turn will hand over to Professor Shishir Saxena. And as I said, a very big welcome from us at Ahmedabad to Professor Nasr.
Thank you, Professor French. My name is Hadi Talwani. I'm a second-year student at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. And I'm pursuing a major in life sciences and a minor in philosophy. It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce to you all our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Professor Nasr is the University Professor of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., a position he has held for over 3 decades now. He was born in Tehran in 1933, and in certain conversations has described his childhood home as one in which there was constant talk of cultural and religious matters, and where poetry flowed freely like the morning breeze. Interestingly, he also had a childhood connection to Indian thinkers and ideas. His father hosted Rabindranath Tagore when the latter visited Persia and also spoke to him highly of Mahatma Gandhi. He was the first Iranian to study at MIT, where he began his studies at the elite physics department. However, it was here that he began to doubt physics would help him understand the nature of physical reality. And in fact, it was a very interesting episode with none other than Bertrand Russell that, to use Professor Nasr's own words, became the straw that broke the camel's back and made him decide to leave the field of physics. After MIT, he decided to study the more descriptive natural sciences, and in 1956 received his master's in geology and geophysics from Harvard University. He then shifted to the history of science department for his doctoral studies, and his PhD thesis came out later as the book An Introduction to Islamic Cosmological Doctrines. Professor Nasr returned to Iran in 1958. Here, he became a prominent and respected academic, teaching philosophy at Tehran University, where he later went on to serve as the Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty of Letters. Professor Nasr has a prodigious body of scholarly work and achievements, some of which I shall briefly mention. He was the first Muslim to deliver the prestigious Gifford and Cadbury lectures. He was also inducted to the Library of Living Philosophers in 2000. And an honor which places him in the company of Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, and other luminaries of 20th century intellectual life. He has published over 50 books and 650 articles on Islamic science, philosophy, comparative religion, Islamic ecology and environmentalism, art, and Sufism. Professor Nazar's life work has been to expound and defend tradition. That's tradition with a capital T, and we are very happy to welcome him to our university. And I can say on behalf of the student community here that we are very excited to hear him speak today. I now request Professor Saxena to take further today's proceedings.
All right. Thank you, Hardi, and a very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Shishir Saxena, and I'm an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences of Ahmedabad University, where I teach philosophy, specifically Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. At our school, we try to introduce students to a variety of philosophical traditions from across the world, and thereby demonstrate and teach them of the rich philosophical heritage of humankind. We thus currently offer courses not only on different aspects of what is generally known as the Western philosophical tradition, but also on Indian philosophy and very soon Islamic philosophy as well. An important component of our ambition here is to not only introduce students to the philosophical aspects of these and other traditions, but in fact to also encourage our students to acquire the linguistic skills. So whether it's in Sanskrit or Persian or French or even other languages, skills which are undisputably a prerequisite for any study of primary texts. And it is for this reason that the program at our school, where these courses are taught, is known as Philosophy, History and Languages, PHL, as we understand that the effort to build serious scholarship of these intellectual traditions, especially non-Western philosophical traditions, requires training, both philosophical and philological. Now, given our ambitions at the university, I am indeed delighted that Professor Nasr has accepted our invitation and agreed to speak here today on a topic which I think is extremely relevant and important, not only for our university, but also for the times that we all live in. And now, before I ask Professor Nasr to begin his talk, I would just briefly like to let you all know that Professor Nasr will speak for about 40 to 50 minutes, after which we will have a session for questions and answers for about 30 to 40 minutes. If there's any question that you would like to present to Professor Nasr, please feel free to write it in the chat box and send it to me. Time permitting, I will try to present your question to Professor Nasr after his talk. However, just when you do send me your question, can I please request that you also include your name and your academic affiliation, if any. And now, without any further delay, I warmly request and invite Professor Nasr to begin his talk. Professor Nasr, over to you.
I begin with the name of God. I always begin my lectures, so I want to thank all of you, the leaders of this university, and the young lady who introduced me, for your kindness. India has a very special spot in my heart. These days, I do not accept many invitations of this kind. They come all the time, but India is something else. I've been to India numerous times. The first time, 1961, when I spent the whole month in India studying manuscripts of Islamic philosophy in various Indian libraries, which are extremely rich, especially from the later Islamic philosophy from the time of the Mughals on, when a lot of Persian philosophers came to India. And I've visited India numerous times since. I've known the late, personally, Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, who was a good friend of mine, Rajiv Gandhi, poor people, they're all assassinated. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, who was a philosopher, and when I was young, I knew him quite well, and I could go down the list of a large number of people from your country whom I've known over the years, and I've always been very much interested in every aspect of affairs pertaining to India. And of course, very sad what happened with the change of atmosphere in which the openness of Hinduism suddenly shriveled somewhat, and now the problem with the Islamic community. But worse than that, what has happened with the coronavirus. I pray for all the people of India, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, whatever they are, that God will help them in this very difficult moment. I know India is in a very critical situation, but God willing, He will pull through. India has had many other tragedies and has always faced everything with courage that it's the land in which the presence of God is to be felt everywhere, in which the help of God is, in a sense, there for everyone. And I hope they will draw from their spiritual sustenance and reserve that they have in their culture to face this difficult moment. When asked to give the lecture today, we decided on the subject of the case of non-Western philosophies, with special attention being paid to Islamic philosophy. So let me begin with a little theoretical discussion, which is very important and carried out by a number of people in both the West and the Islamic world and India. At the use of the term philosophy itself, a lot of people in the West thought until recently that there was only philosophy in the West. Some of Greece was west of Ireland. They didn't know where Greece was, and it was part of the European world, nothing about the Eastern Mediterranean world of Egypt, of Persia, things like that. It was all away from the map of the Renaissance idea, which grew much later in the later centuries in the West, that philosophy begins with the Greeks and the Greeks and come to the West. It's a special Western art. All the books of history of philosophy did not have anything about Hindu philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, Taoist philosophy, Confucian. And if they had a small chapter in Islamic philosophy, it was called Arabic philosophy, because I could not avoid having this bridge between Aristotle and Thomas, except through, of course, the writings in Arabic of Ibn Sina and others, and the translations that were made from Greek into Arabic and then from Arabic into Latin. That was unavoidable. But Islamic philosophy was never taken seriously as a discipline until recently, when a big change has come about in the Western world. There's still a long ways to go, but at least some change has come about. So we have to start with this thesis. If by philosophy we mean the use of human reason and the empirical faculties of the human beings in order to construct a reality independent of every other consideration, yes, then yes, this is only a Western practice. The Chinese haven't done it, the Japanese haven't done it, the Persians haven't done it, they've lived for thousands of years. But if you understand by philosophy what Pythagoras, who invented the word, understood by it, and followed by Plato, that is the love of wisdom of Sophia, then philosophy is far from being limited to one continent, one subcontinent, one peninsula. In a sense, Europe is the peninsula of Asia. The rest of the land is devoid of thinking, and that's only one corner of it. Everybody begins to think, and great philosophy develops. This is not at all true. Every great civilization has produced philosophy in the second sense. That is a vision of the nature of reality based on both intellectual and rational, as well as empirical context of human beings with the world around them. There, of course, what I gave itself was a philosophical definition. We can discuss and debate it, but in a short lecture like that, I cannot do more than that, but something like that, So let's first of all accept this more universal meaning of philosophy, and it's being now more and more accepted in the West. The days in the 1950s, when I was at Harvard, until now, 67 years have passed. Even during that time, at my own lifetime, from the time I was a student to now that I'm a professor, I've been for many years in this country, exiled from Iran after the Iranian Revolution. More and more, there's now attention being paid to non-Western philosophies. It began really in the 60s with the New Age and interest in the Orient and so forth, which was not very profound intellectually, but emotionally was very strong, but it brought about a transformation, and combined, of course, with the post-Second World War interest and translation more and more of intellectual works of the East, for example, Zen Buddhism, which becomes suddenly so popular in the West after the Second World War. It really goes back to Suzuki's remarkable work on the essays on Zen Buddhism, which were written before the Second World War, but it suddenly flowered after the Second World War, and we go down for Hinduism, for Islam, the great traditions of the East, one after another. More and more works became available. The philosophy departments in the West resisted completely. There are very, very, very few departments of philosophy, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, where Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy dominates over the philosophy departments, which accept non-Western philosophy as philosophy. I was for 20 years professor of philosophy at Tehran University. I'm now professor of Islamic Studies. And although I have a little fame as an Islamic philosopher, the philosophy department is not interested in having me as one of their professors. Their students come to me and they study with me. So I've had a lot of first-hand experience of this. The philosophy department have resisted. They do not consider anything outside of not only the whole of the Western philosophical tradition, but the Anglo-Saxon analytical Oxford school that began really in the 1930s, going back to the School of Vienna and so on and so on. I don't want to go into the history of Western philosophy right now. That is philosophy. But parallel with that, more and more the awareness is being created that there is such a thing as non-Western philosophy. From the time that Moore and Radhakrishnan and people like that wrote books on Indian philosophy, and Surendranath Dasgupta wrote a remarkable book, which is still a source. We don't have something like that for Islamic philosophy even now. A remarkable, very large work. He was a great scholar, and English was very prevalent in India. In contrast, in let's say my own country, Iran, where nobody spoke any English, French was a foreign language. Everybody wrote in Persian, and there's nothing produced in Iran of any consequence in the English language concerning Islamic philosophy at that time. But despite that, it took some time for gradually awareness to be created that this is just not only something that belongs to the Sanskrit department because it's done by Dasgupta. It belongs to philosophy. The same with the Tao Te Ching commentaries of Chuang Tzu, all the remarkable Chinese philosophical tradition, the Islamic philosophical tradition. Gradually, this is changing. Even at Harvard University, which is the center of Western philosophy already, and the most adamant defenders of analytical philosophy, like Quine, the grandpapa of the school, you might say, was a Harvard professor. He died recently. I know him quite well personally, but of course we didn't meet eye to eye philosophically by any means. Anyway, this is now beginning to change, which is very, very important. And it's in this context that I want to say something in the short time that is given to me about one of these non-Western schools of philosophy, which is very rich and also unique in the sense that it somehow bridges also the world of Eastern philosophies and Western philosophy in many, many ways, and that is Islamic philosophy. First of all, let me begin with the name. Talking in India, there's no problem. In the West, because of the medieval texts which were translated of Islamic philosophy into Latin from Arabic, this was called Arabic philosophy, Philosophia Arabis in Latin. And this was not a nationalistic usage of the term Arabic in the same way that Latin philosophy was called Latin philosophy. Although Roger Bacon was not Latin, he was an Englishman. He knew some Latin, of course, but that was not his mother tongue. I'm sure he didn't eat Italian food at home. And he was an Englishman, a very deep Englishman. But he was called the Latin philosopher. Robert Grosseteste, all of these northern great philosophers and thinkers of Scotland, Ireland, England, the Great Britain of today, they were all called Latin. So this term was used, and it was called Arabic, which is totally wrong now. Totally wrong, because Arab nationalism tried to incorporate this and make everything Islamic Arabic and excluding the country of the Persian and field of philosophy. I'm a Persian, I should not say this, but about 85–90% of all important Islamic philosophers are Persians, except for the School of Andalusia and one or two Egyptians. The rest are from the Central Asian, Persianate world of Eastern Islam, obviously. But anyway, this went about, and a war was fought over the use of the term. And I was the person who, even from my young days, when I wrote my first article as a graduate student at Harvard, always used the term Islamic philosophy, and we finally won the day. In 1964, I published with Henri Corbin, the famous French scholar, one of the great scholars of the West produced in Islamic philosophy, a little book called Histoire de la Philosophie Islamique in French, which has been also translated into many European languages, Italian, English, and so forth, in which on purpose we emphasized the importance of the word Islamic, that is Islamic philosophy, and that had a very important impact on my own humble works, and gradually for example, Musa and Mahdi, others who were Arabs who had been using the word Arabic, once in a while they all changed. And fortunately now the battle is won. It's finished already. There are Arabs who pay a lot of money for a journal to be published at Cambridge University in England called Arabic Philosophy. All right, that's just oil money. When the oil dries up, that's going to finish. But intellectually, it's now done. It's Islamic philosophy. Now, this is important to understand that in the East, it is the worldview which comes from revelation, from religion, from intuition, from ultimate vision of reality that determines actually a culture. So we say Chinese culture, that's ethnic, that's not religious or philosophical, but ultimately it's the Confucian Taoist traditions that determine Chinese culture. In the case of Islam, so we say Chinese, why don't we say Arabic, Persian, and so forth? In the case of Islam, Islam means both religion and a civilization. I have a book that's called Science and Civilization in Islam, as an answer to the famous book Science and Civilization in China, which all of you know, it's a 7-volume work. I wanted to get a response from the point of Islamic world. There was one person and they had a group doing it. Anyway, Islam can also mean that. And so by Islamic philosophy, we mean all philosophy that was cultivated, pursued, expounded in the Islamic world by Muslims and also by minorities who were not Muslims but share more or less the Islamic philosophical worldview, like some of the early Christian philosophers. A lot of people in the West say, oh, all of these early Christians, there are 3 or 4, that's all. That's all. Or there are hundreds and hundreds of Islamic philosophers in your own country, in India. You have had a few Hindus who contributed to Islamic philosophy during the time of Akbar and other, and some remarkable works have been done. However, the rest are all Muslims. Now, there might have been one Christian somehow there living in Lahore or something like that, but that's all right. It doesn't change that. So first of all, we have Islamic philosophy as a philosophy that was cultivated in the Islamic world from the period of formation of Islamic culture and civilization, from the very first century. Gradually, by the 2nd century, translations were made from Greek, but already before that, you had the philosophy that was drawn from the Quran and Hadith. You had the ground already, and this is something that the West usually doesn't pay attention to, and they consider Islamic philosophy to be a kind of, I always say jokingly, I've said it 100 times, like in the old days when they played basketball, the first half was over, and then someone would bring a bucket with water, and the players would sit down and clear their face, and we take the bucket away, second half would begin. And the role of Islam in civilization, from the Western point of view, was that of the bucket person, who had the great Greek period in the West, and somehow the West was resting for a while, and then the bucket boy comes and keeps the water there, and then the West is ready to start play again, the bucket boy goes away. That view, which I say, always use jokingly, is, however, of course, totally false. The Islamic philosophical tradition began in the 2nd Islamic century. You might say, why? That's a very important question. And many scholars tried to answer it, because you can understand why the Japanese, after the Meiji Restoration, suddenly began to translate all these works from European language to Japanese. You can understand that. It changed Japan from a medieval, in a positive sense, beautiful civilization into the world's 2nd economy. I have a Japanese car driving in the United States. whereas Henry Ford was not Japanese, he was American. So I'm sure you all know about this yourself. This remarkable civilization, they did that. They did this tremendous translation, and we know why. Why did the Muslims suddenly spend so much of the intellectual and even financial, because they made resources possible? There's a center of translation in Baghdad and all kinds of places like that. Why did they use this effort? Why did the caliphs, with no knowledge of science and philosophy, were willing to spend the money of the Beit al-Mal, the public treasury, for something like that? Many of our governments today don't do it. They don't understand the importance. When I was in Iran, I was trying to get government to sponsor, put money down for translation of books from European language to Persian. Nobody on the government was interested. Our university budget had to be used. I couldn't get any money from the government for that. When I was president of the university, I used to just put some budget aside for that. So you had this. Why did this is itself a remarkable fact? And people, some of the people who are listening to me are Muslims in India who are heirs actually to this philosophical and scientific tradition, and they have to understand the dynamics that went on. Here you had this vast empire created by the Umayyads, going from Sindh to southern France. Vast, one of the vastest empires in the world ever created. Very powerful. Why did it need Aristotle? Why did it need Aristotle? Why did it need Plato? Much, all kinds of theories have been given, which are about practical need and so on. Or for astronomy, I accept. The more exact astronomy of Ptolemy than we had, let's say, pre-Islamic astronomy. All right, but all the philosophical works. Why? I believe that the reason is very clear. Every religion is based on a particular aspect of human reality, although it has to consider the whole of human reality. Islam is a religion of knowledge. What makes a Muslim is La ilaha illallah. That is, there is no reality but the divine reality. That's a statement of knowledge. It's not a statement of sacrifice, of service, even of love. Those are all there, but it's primarily a statement of knowledge. Now, when you base yourself on knowledge, you cannot be indifferent as you can otherwise. A Christian could say, my religion is a religion of love. I don't care whether the earth is round or square, is a trapezoid or not. Although that, of course, is not completely, would create a challenge for Christian theology. But that's what really, after the Galileo trial, the Catholic Church did. It washed its hands off modern science and cosmology, and for several centuries didn't pay any attention to it. Now it's coming back to it, of course, because of the environmental crisis. Islam could not afford that. Once you claim that you're a mathematician and 2 and 2 is 4, if somebody comes up with a view that 2 and 2 is 4.5, you're going to say in the Quran, lakum dinakum walid-din, as the Quran says, to you your religion and to me mine. They cannot do that with knowledge. You can do that with many other things, with ethics, with art, with politics, but you cannot do that with knowledge. That's why in the field of modern physics is a form of knowledge. You cannot say, all right, your theory is for you and my theory is for me. No, either my theory is correct or your theory is correct. Or both are false or both are correct aspects of different reality, but somehow you have to come to terms with it. That, I believe, is the reason why Islam, at the peak of political and military power, without any need of reading Aristotle, no financial benefit, nothing you could see. So it was not agricultural treatise that was translated that would make irrigation easier in Syria. It wasn't that at all. That spend an inordinate amount of its spiritual, intellectual, and financial resources for the translation of works into Arabic. But that happened. That happened because I think the challenge was realized. That is what the story. I don't want to take too much time, but I've discovered that myself over decades ago. Many people have written about it since. In the Islamic world, you had a tradition which went on until very recently, in which the ruler, the caliph, the sultan, the emir, whoever it was, would assemble people together to discuss intellectual, philosophical, and religious matters. And we know that all of the Umayyads were not great scholars at all. They were administrators, rulers, and so forth, Muawiyah, Yazid, Marwan, and so forth, very famous caliphs. They were not known as being scholars, but they had those sessions. They invited leaders and scholars to discuss various issues. At that time, Islam had just established itself in what's called the Middle East now. There were still important Christian minorities, Jewish, Zoroastrian, smaller group of Sabians, and so on and so on. A little farther east, you had Buddhists in what is today Eastern Afghanistan, then part of Persia, and of course, farther away, Hindus and so forth. A plethora of various religions. And their scholars would be invited by the caliph, we have records of it, to discuss religious issues. And the Christian theologians, who for centuries have been studying Plato and Aristotle and developing arguments for the Trinity, some of the greatest theologians of Christianity, Clement of Alexandria, people like that, had already, in a sense, infused Christian thinking with Greek philosophical ideas, and also provided arguments for the defense of Christian doctrine, especially a difficult doctrine such as that of Trinity, which didn't stand well with Muslims who emphasize so much unity. Anyway, the Christian theologian in front of the caliph was able to provide all kinds of arguments for the Trinity. The Muslims sitting there couldn't offer any arguments because they don't have the knowledge. They don't have the philosophical knowledge to do what the Christian did. It's at that time that the newly founded civilization of Islam, still having a great deal of spiritual intellectual energy, realized its challenge. Realized its challenge, and one of the most remarkable events in human history took place within two 75-year periods. From 75 to 125 of the Hijrah, from 125 to 200 of the Hijrah, that is the 8th and 9th centuries, you had this remarkable Bible translation of works into Arabic. Primo from Greek, then Syriac, some of which had been from Greek into Syriac into Arabic, and then two languages of the East, Pahlavi and Sanskrit. Pahlavi and Sanskrit played an important role in some of the sciences and astronomy and mathematics, like the zero, which came from Indian mathematics into Islamic mathematics and so forth. It was a very interesting fact itself, because it corresponds to a metaphysical idea of Hinduism, Kha, the center, which is the center of the modern Indian flag, that point at the center, which is really the center of being. And zero corresponds to the principle of everything. It's all or nothing, in a sense, no thing. It's a very profound and very difficult idea. That's why there's remarkable development of Greek mathematics. There was no idea of zero. Although the Pythagoreans had an indication of it, but there was no zero. And so it comes from India. So all these 3 or 4 languages, things were translated into Arabic. And on the basis of that, Islamic philosophy began. Islamic philosophy began as a response to the challenge of especially Christian theologians who belonged to an Abrahamic faith, but who had mastered philosophy and logic and could defend their faith on the basis of philosophy and logic. And the Muslims realized they had to do the same. And so the caliphate comes. We've never seen that in human history like that, except the Japanese after the major restoration. We did the same thing, in which the government would create a beautiful campus with houses and so forth for translators. And they would be paid salaries, and every book they translate, in addition to the salary, they would weigh it and would pay them in large dinars or gold or something like that. They were very well off. The families were well off, school for the children, hospitals, everything you can imagine. And all they had to do was sit down and translate. If you think this is a small task, I always say this to Muslims when I lecture in the Islamic world. Look at the Islamic world today. 1.5 billion people, all the money in the world, half the oil money of the world is in the Islamic world. And look at the pitiful, pitiful record we've had in the 2 main languages of the Islamic world, Arabic and Persian. I don't know the other languages, I would not say anything about them, but these 2 languages I know. One is my mother tongue, and I know a bit of Arabic. Look, our record after 2 centuries with this large population is much worse than our ancestors 1,200 years ago. It's really amazing. I always say jokingly, I've been very critical about this in front of Anwar Sadat in Egypt, the president of Egypt, very high level officials. When in the Islamic world, I don't care because it's the truth. Look at this. These people who translated these works into Arabic, which made Islamic philosophy possible, were people who knew Arabic very well. Many of them were Arabs. Many of them were Arab Christians. They were Arabs. They were mother tongue, but they were Christians. They knew Greek very well. And they knew Syriac. And they knew the subject. They were either physicians or philosophers who knew the subject. And I said jokingly, now we have all these 4 conditions of Islamic world, but in reverse. We have translators who know neither English, nor really Arabic or Persian, nor the subject. They translate all the time, and that's the result. That's the result why we have not produced Farabis and Messinas as we should have done after 2 centuries of translation of Western texts. Anyway, Islamic philosophy then begins in this atmosphere in which it's challenged by development of logic and certain forms of philosophy, the Platonic philosophy, Proclus, Iamblichus, others that have been Christianized. I don't want to get into details of history of philosophy and throw a large number of Greek words on your head. So I abstain from that. But anyway, the most famous one, like Proclus, I'm going back to, of course, to Plotinus and Plato and Aristotle themselves. You had a challenge actually from the Christian side. You had a challenge from Islamic scholars who were against it. Not everyone was in favor. Not everyone was in favor. There were some fuqaha, some faqihs, some jurisprudents who were against Islamic philosophy that has remained to this very present day. In the same way in Hindu India, in a very different context, you have certain pundits who've been against Samkhya, let's say, some Nyaya or this school or that school. We had the same thing in the Islamic world. I'm not going to comparative discussion at the present moment. Anyway, despite all of this, despite this, very rapidly Islamic philosophy developed. It developed in Mesopotamia, in what later on became the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. In fact, it began, I said later on, I mean after the Umayyad period, but it really began to develop during the Abbasid period in the 9th century, with Baghdad at its center. Of course, the first Islamic philosopher, Abu Yaqub al-Kindi, was from Basra, which is a port on the Persian Gulf. Even now, amid the Iraqi war, was all talk of Basra. It's a very, very old and ancient city, older than Baghdad. Older than Baghdad. Baghdad was designed actually by Muslims. There was no Baghdad. There's no pre-Islamic Baghdad. There is pre-Islamic Damascus. But Cairo and Baghdad are cities which begin with Islamic civilization. You think of these old cities, I mean, they're old, but not like Damascus or Benares, which are millennia old, you might say. Anyway, it begins in Basra and Baghdad, especially Baghdad. And from there, a school of philosophy develops, which is called the School of Baghdad. And then it spreads into another land, which was always a rival of Baghdad intellectually and spiritually, and always, I mean, at that time, in the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, and that is Khorasan. Khorasan, of course, today is the province of Iran. But 2/3 of the greater Khorasan have been cut off from Iran by the Russian Empire and the British, both of them. Khorasan actually extends to what is today northern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, going all the way to the east of the Central Asian states to Tajikistan. That was the Greater Khorasan. The two great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, which are today located in Uzbekistan, being the two great intellectual centers of the Khorasan of that day. And philosophy very rapidly spread to that area. Why? Really do not know. There's so many different factors. Why did it spread somewhere else? Why there are so many great philosophers of Iran who come from Shiraz in the later days? Mullah Sadra, people like that, but in the early days, they come from Khorasan. It's very hard to say. There are all kinds of theories. We don't have to bother about that, but we should know the fact because it's very important with Islamic philosophy. And it's there that you have the figures of Farabi and Ibn Sina and the primary students of Ibn Sina appearing, and Islamic philosophy becomes established. Farabi came to Baghdad. He did not like it. He went to Damascus where he died. But Ibn Sina even refused to come to Baghdad. He was invited by the Caliph many times. He never left Persia. Died in Hamadan, was born in what we call Central Asia today, in Balkh, which is in Afghanistan, part of the greater Persia. And that land becomes a great center of Islamic philosophy. And this is very significant for India, for the Muslims of India. But I'll get to that in just a second. I don't want to overrun my time. This philosophy then begins to develop. Different dynasties come, some supported more, some supported less. The Seljuks were less interested. The Buyids were more interested. I don't want to get into the details of Islamic history. Some of you may not even know the name of these dynasties. But don't just remembering that some governments supported the so-called intellectual sciences, including philosophy, some less so. That's all we need to know for the moment. It's a very complicated matter, very complicated matter involving Islamic law, Islamic theology, and local politics, all of them. So that's a story for another day. I've written about that also. I don't want to talk about it now. Anyway, the Mongol invasion, paradoxically, which destroyed so much of the Western Islamic world. It didn't get into India. We were lucky. But much of Persia was laid waste. Much of Iraq, Syria, got all the way to the Sinai Peninsula. It didn't go any more west, where Egypt was not touched. Cairo was never invaded by the Mongols. But all of the great cities, which had been centers of Islamic culture, were devastated, the worst of which was Nishabur, which they say was the first city in history that had 1 million population. And everyone was killed. You see, even the cats and dogs were killed. There was not one living creature left. Everyone was killed. And this is a city where the Ghazalis and so many great scholars had studied. It was called the city of Islamic science and so forth. So there's a tremendous shock. But paradoxically, this did not curtail Islamic philosophical activity. Not at all. This remarkable figure of Nasruddin Tusi, and before him Sohrawardi, who came before the Mongol invasion, you had a remarkable revival of Islamic philosophy. And if there's one thing that the students who are listening to me today should remember, that the idea that Islamic philosophy died with Ibn Rushd, with Averroes, that we keep reading about over and over and over again in Western books, and books taught in the subcontinent of India, of Dibor and others, both Pakistan and India, Islamic philosophy is still, after all centuries, they regurgitate this error. It's not true. Islamic philosophy did not come to an end at all with the death of Averroes. In fact, the death of Averroes means the end of Islamic philosophy in Andalusia. Soon the Christians took over, and that was the end of Andalusian civilization, Islamic Andalusian civilization. It didn't mean the end of Islamic philosophy. Islamic philosophy flowers in a remarkable way at the time of the Mongol invasion. Very, very strange. Because some of the constraints of the ulama were lifted. That's probably the reason. And the Sufi order became very strong. Later, Islamic philosophy is very much in accord with much of Sufism. Sohrawardi, for example, was both a philosopher and a Sufi, was initiated in Sufi at the age of 22. And because I'm addressing India, it's important to mention that this time, that Islamic philosophy enters into India. That the intellectual Islamic elite becomes interested in Islamic philosophy. Even Ibn Sina, who lived before that, became so famous in India later. There were so many schools before modern times of Ibn Sina. He became famous in India after the 7th century. And so it was on the wing of Shah, the School of Illumination, of Sohrawardi's philosophy, later Islamic philosophy, which is in more accord with the more illuminative way of thinking of the East than the discursive, rational thinking of the West. Islamic philosophy spread more and more into the subcontinent of India, and that's all I can mention about it now. My time is up, but I just want to mention one thing. And I'm addressing really Muslims in India. I speak as a Muslim. We should really be ashamed of ourselves. We have had 700 years of Islamic philosophy in India, the production of many, many important works, including comparative philosophy, which is very popular now. Comparison with Hindu philosophy, incredible works that have never been really fully studied. It's a completely virgin field, except of course Dar al-Shugu is known, Bahrain is known, but nevertheless, it's relatively a known field still. And there's not one book in the English language called The History of Islamic Philosophy in India. Can you imagine that? The philosophy of hundreds of millions of people over centuries. I mean, this I'm sorry to say, I'm talking as a Muslim myself, it's disgusting that we are in such a situation. You have hundreds of books on the history of philosophy in Italy or France or one single country, or Germany, and here we are. And the same on the other side. The Ottoman War was the most powerful empire for 700 years in the world, 600 years. It was centered in Istanbul. It produced a great deal of Islamic philosophy. If you people in India ask me, is there a book I can read about that? What can I say? There are some books in Turkish, apparently. There's a book of Maulana Nadwi in Urdu, in 2 volumes in Urdu, but those books are not known at all. And here you and I, who do not know Turkish, where did we go? 1924, just after Ataturk took over Turkey, a man called Ziya Ülken, a Turkish scholar, wrote a book on Islamic philosophy, which has a little bit about Islamic philosophy in Turkey. That's a drop in the bucket. And so when we talk about Islamic philosophy, it's not only Ibn Sina, it's not only Farabi, it's not only Averroes, it's not only Ghazali's debate with Ibn Sina, it's not only a medieval phenomenon, it's a reality that comes up right to our own day. Islamic philosophy deeply revived in the Safavid period by Mir Damad, Mullah Sadra, exactly at the time when it was influencing India a great deal. That 1961 trip I made to India was to study especially the manuscripts of Mullah Sadra. I found over 3,000 manuscripts of Mullah Sadra, the libraries of India, from Patna to Hyderabad to Benares itself, Hindu library, Benares. So you have this revival of Islamic philosophy in the Soviet period, with tremendous relationship with India. You really cannot write an intellectual history of India, moving the blinkers of 19th century nationalism, was Hindu or Muslim, put that as, objective, without paying attention to this. They're Hindu commentators upon Mullah Sadra, Hindu commentators upon his ideas. And vice versa. The Muslim thinkers who belong to the school, Mir Fenderesky, who wrote a commentary upon Yoga Vasista, vast commentary. the most important single philosophical commentary in the inter-Islamic Hindu field. There's nothing like it. Monumental commentary, although a couple of books have been written on it, it's not been fully translated or printed or anything like that. And here it is, Sanskrit on one side, Persian on the other side. One of the major philosophers of Islam, Mir Fenderovsky, was one of the top-notch philosophers of the Soviet period. He himself wrote this book. It's not the West who invented comparative philosophy that's not becoming popular. Hindus and Muslims were at it a long time before. And so we have this rich intellectual tradition, which I hope with what you're doing here in Ahmedabad, other places in India, India would be an ideal place for its flowering. India has so many advantages, historically speaking. I cannot go into it now. Not every Hindu is Shankaracharya, I didn't say that, but the intellectual, spiritual, metaphysical tradition is so strong. The openness to other cultures has been so strong. The contact with the Persian world has been so strong for 1,000 years. Persian was used as a language in India until 1911. A Hindu and a Tamil, from the north and south of India, excuse me, a Hindi speaking and a Tamil speaking Hindu from north and south. If they wanted to defend themselves in court during the British period, what language would they use? It was Persian. The British did a lot of the work to replace Persian by English. But until 1911, you could still defend yourself in court in India in Persian. So you have this vast heritage. And let me conclude by saying that, first of all, to pay attention to non-Western philosophies, not as derivative and secondary, but as alternative worldviews, each of which has something very precious to offer. Like art, every part of humanity has something to offer. No matter how beautiful Chinese art is, if you didn't have Giotto in Italy, there would be a great loss for humanity, obviously. In the same way, in the field of philosophy. Secondly, the Islamic philosophical tradition continues right down to our own day. I myself consider myself to belong to this tradition as a living tradition. I studied for years with traditional masters, learning the oral tradition of Islamic philosophy. And I know from first-hand experience, it's not dead, still alive, as is also Hindu philosophy, as is Chinese philosophy, despite the coming of communism, despite the colonial domination over India, despite the French influence in Iran, all of these things that occurred in the 19th century, which curtailed, weakened these traditions, they're still very much alive. And paradoxically, they speak about certain truths of which many people in the West feel in need. That is why so many of the most philosophical-minded students in the best universities in America, my own university, Harvard, they don't go to the philosophy department. They go to study Hinduism or Islam or comparative philosophy or religion, something like that. So there's something there that's very important at a particular moment of our intellectual and human history. And I think the great philosophers of Asia, if taken seriously, can render great service both to their own people in giving them a sense of certitude, self-trust in their own way of thinking, and not just being lackeys and slaves to some other form of thinking. And secondly, provide many people in the West with keys to rediscover forgotten truths, which also exist in the Western tradition, but have been forgotten for a long time. So I think what you're doing is very, very important. And I think because of what India is, the fact that you're located in India and not in Burma or Vietnam or somewhere else is a very important fact. And I pray that you will be very successful in your task. I think I've said enough. My time is over. I'm usually a very meticulous person, observing time, but I shall be glad to answer a few questions if anyone has any.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Nasr, for this very interesting talk. I mean, for tracing almost the history of the Islamic philosophical tradition. I mean, there are, of course, several similarities, which I can, of course, make out even with the Indian philosophical tradition, for example. I mean, where it starts, the moment of its tremendous growth. I mean, for example, within the Indian tradition, within the various Brahmanical schools, the challenges of the Buddhist thinking, of the Jaina thinkings, the various, the Charvakas, for example, I mean, how it grows. And even, for example, what Dr. Nasr, what you were talking about, you know, the question about if Islamic philosophy, for example, is in the past now. There was Islamic philosophy, or is there really Islamic philosophy even today? These are very similar questions, even within the Indian philosophical world. Is Sanskrit, for example, dead, or does Sanskrit philosophy continue to debate? So I think these are a whole host of questions, some very important, some very important questions and issues, which I think Professor Nasr has brought about. And of course, I now welcome questions. I think there have been some already, and I'll try and take a look at some of them. But perhaps, why don't I start with, let me try to perhaps, there was one which came in right at the very beginning itself. And let me perhaps try and, maybe let me phrase this perhaps, Dr. Nasr, as a philosophical opponent, a Purva Paksha, for example, from the Sanskritic world. Dr. Nasr, you spoke about how philosophy, for example, especially with Islam and several of these other non-Western traditions, often tends to begin with revelation. And perhaps, I mean, people could argue that this, in fact, renders it as not being philosophy. I mean, this should therefore be within the purview of religion. In fact, there was an earlier question by David Collins saying that much of modern Western philosophy is about quote unquote, analyzing truth claims. In previous centuries, however, it was also about transforming our lives. Would Professor Nasr comment on the role of philosophy in Islam in terms of analysis or personal transformation? So, this idea that several of these other traditions, so whether it is the Indian philosophical tradition, whether it is Islam, very often it's not just the intellectual aspect of philosophical thinking. It also involves personal transformation and so on and so forth. So does this, by this very definition, render it as not being philosophy?
میگه اگر فلسفه بر اساس وحی باشه دیگه فلسفه نیستش، میگه که این نقشش در اسلام چی بوده؟
Depends on how you define philosophy. Philosophy has to begin from somewhere. It cannot begin from nothing. Obviously, you have to have mathematics, and then you have philosophy of mathematics. You have to have physics, then you have philosophy of physics. You have to have a society, then you have political philosophy. So philosophy always bases itself on a knowledge which is derived by some means in another discipline, you might say, or in philosophy, but narrowed down to a particular way of looking at things. Now, throughout history, the traditional anthropology, the structure of man, I mean, of course, male and female, the human being, the structure of man, which was taught and believed in various traditions, included not only the physical reality of human beings, not only the psychic reality, not only the mental reality, but also the intellectual and the spiritual reality. I've always made a clear distinction between the mental and the intellectual, between the rational and the intellectual. The two are not the same. And if St. Thomas Aquinas was sitting here right now, he would agree with me completely. It's not only in Islam. The word intellectus in Latin is not the same as ratio, not at all. The two became the same when the whole intellectual world of the West really collapsed in the 17th century. That has intellectual in medieval sense, medieval philosophy was rejected, and the word intellect was rejected. Now, intellect in its original sense has to do also with light, with illumination, with receiving of knowledge beyond the mental carapace of the individual human being. Therefore, it was always related to also that other source of knowledge, which is revelation. And to say that philosophy had nothing to do with revelation, it's only based on ratiocination, is to misunderstand the issue completely. First of all, the agnostic or anti-religious philosophers who make such a statement, they themselves do not test the foundation of their own philosophy. Where did that come from? Where did that come from? All right, they reject that it came from God, but it came from their ego. It came from somewhere. So you have to start with premises. In logic, you cannot have a syllogism without premises. You cannot make a logical statement without premises. And so if you study even philosophy technically, you cannot evade this very important issue that philosophy begins to philosophize about what the mind, the soul, the human being knows or experiences about reality, the world outside or the world inside or the world simply outside here or transcendent, whatever it is. And we, people like myself, were defenders of traditional philosophies, whether it be Islamic, Chinese, or Indian, believe that these philosophies were based on the knowledge of reality, but the reality was not confined to simply what the reason or external senses of human beings can grasp and understand. There are other faculties within us that can understand higher levels of reality, and those are certainly not less real than those which understand only the external aspects. Another question?
All right, thank you very much, Professor Nasr. I think there are several questions which are coming in. I think there are a couple from Terence Clevin. Terry, are you? I can't see you. Would you like to turn on? Oh, yeah. Let me just, there you go. Terry, you could perhaps ask your question directly.
Yes, thanks very much. And thank you very much, Dr. Nasr, for your very intriguing presentation, as well as the work you've done in your publications in the past. I have two questions, not directly related, but they're both, I think, so important to what you're doing and what others are doing, and I would love to hear some more about it.
Could you please ask each question one question at a time?
Okay, very good. The first question has to do with this key phrase, illuminative philosophy, Falsafia Mashrakia. And it seems to distinguish philosophy in the East from later Andalusian philosophy, for the most part at least, and also later European philosophy. What is so central about this term, illuminative, that was important in the presentation you just made, and for a characterization of how this philosophy differs from so much of the Western tradition, and I assume you're referring especially to the positivistic tradition that became so dominant in the 19th and 20th centuries. So that's the first question.
Yes, it's a very important question. In traditional philosophies, including a school in medieval European philosophy associated with Saint Bonaventure, was less Aristotelian and more Platonic among the medieval philosophers and theologians. So you're not unique to Islam. It was considered that God has given man, or man, the human being, has the power of discursive thought, of ratiocination. But also there's the power of the mind to be illuminated by the reality of knowledge itself, because knowledge is a form of light, it's a form of illumination. And in fact, we still use it in English and everyday English in that sense. And therefore, there is such a thing as illuminative knowledge, which we call mashriya or sharia, because of the word Orient is associated with the rising of the sun, and Ishraq and Mashriq and so forth in Arabic and Persian are related together. In the same way that in English is very profound, that in English, the word Orient means both the East and correct direction. Like in the 19th century, said, go west, young man. I'm just joking, go east, young man. Some English author said that in the 19th century, go east, young man. So there is this relationship between the East and illumination. So Mashriqiya, which means Oriental, Mushriqiya or Ishraq means illuminative, illumination, and they both are related to the same root. They're related together. And out of this symbolism of the language, it developed a whole school in Islam associated with Sohrawardi, with the great founder of the School of Illumination, what's called Sheikh al-Ishraq, the Sheikh or Master of Illumination. And the school is called Ishraqi or Illuminative. The word Mashriqiya and Mushriqiya were used by Ibn Sina. And it's very, very interesting in the history of Islamic thought. Ibn Sina, toward the end of his life, is said to have written a book called Al-Hikmat al-Mashriqiya. Because in Arabic, when you write Mashriqiya, since you don't write the declensions, it could be pronounced either Mushriqiya or Mashriqiya. That is either Oriental or illuminative, because of the way that Arabic is written out. So this term, he wrote a book called Hikmat al-Mashriqiya, which is lost. When I was a young man, I studied Ibn Sina for years, and I was looking for this book. I do not know any Hebrew. I found at Oxford a manuscript of a book in the Hebrew alphabet, but said to be the Hikmat al-Mashriqiya of Ibn Sina. Not knowing any Hebrew, I asked some Jewish friends to go and do research on this. Nobody did, and maybe it's there. I don't know. But anyway, we do have a small treatise by Ibn Sina, in which he says, until now, I was writing for the ordinary people. The Mashai peripatetic philosophy is for everyone. Now I'm writing for the intellectual elite, for the Khawas. And what I'm going to write about is Mashriqiya, illuminative or Oriental philosophy. That's all we know. And then, unfortunately, this book also, the rest of it is lost. Only the logic remains. But this section, which I've translated to English completely in one of my writings, the very, very important point in the history of Islamic philosophy. This section sort of is indicative of where Ibn Sina was going. And that's why Sohrawardi, the founder of the School of Illumination, a century and a half later, says that the only person before me who to try to follow this path was Ibn Sina, but didn't get to the end of it. It just began to follow that path. Now your second question.
Yes, okay, so it's a kind of a practical question. Where are the great Arabic manuscript collections in libraries in India? And have these manuscripts been taken to other libraries outside of India? Are they in India? And are these collections properly cataloged? So we have access to these?
Most of these are in northern India, not in southern India, except in Hyderabad. The Ottoman Library in Hyderabad, which is relatively south and in the Bahmanid kingdom in the old days. There's a kingdom independent of the Mongols called the Bahmanids, Bahman, Bahmanid kingdom. And they were in contact with Iran, independent, very much so, independent of the Mughals. And they brought a lot of Persian scholars and also a lot of manuscripts. And the Hyderabad library is very, very rich, very, very, the Saftar Jang library. So you have in Hyderabad, Patna, Delhi, most of the northern cities, Banaras, you have fairly sizable collections of Persian and Arabic manuscripts, dealing especially with Islamic philosophy and Islamic thought.
Thank you very much.
All right. I'll take one more question.
Okay, I think we have Ali Khan Ahmedabad. Ali, do you want to go ahead and ask a question? Ali, you hang on. I think, yeah, now you should be able to unmute. If you could just,
Thank
yeah.
you so much. آقای دکتر سلام عرض میکنم خدمت حضرت عالی. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. My question is this: to what extent is a kind of philosophical tradition embedded in our literary traditions of the Islamic cultures and civilizations? For example, if one was to sort of chart an intellectual history of the ghazal as a genre across cultures and language in Arabic and Turkish and Farsi and Urdu, this would be also be marked by a particular philosophical quest. Because of course, unlike the modern West, where we separate the literary from the philosophical, I think these are very much intricately and intimately linked to each other.
Definitely. First of all, what is Mr. Shiraz doing there? Salam alaikum. The former student of mine. MashaAllah. What are you doing in India? Are you in India? Good luck to you. Now, let's go to this. Is a very important issue. Usually throughout history, what we could call mystical philosophy or astrological philosophy was much more closely associated with poetry than the logical, rational philosophy that's associated with Aristotle and his school. And this is in the Islamic world, because of the centrality of poetry, going back to the importance of the Quran, which has a chapter against the poets, the shu'ara, but the structure is very, very poetical. And wherever Islam went, has caused a kind of flowering of poetry, including in Iran itself. We have no poems of the Sassanid period of any consequence. Within a short time, Iran becomes the center of one of the greatest poetical traditions in the world, to the extent that it affects the whole cultural life of the subcontinent of India. The people like Hafez and Rumi and so forth are as famous in India as they are in Iran. In the Islamic world, poetry remained a permissible vehicle for the expression of philosophy. Whereas in the West, especially after the Middle Ages, that was no longer the case. First of all, you have very, very few Western philosophers who are also good poets, whereas we have a lot of Persian ones. I mean, Nasr Khosrow was one of the greatest poets of the Persian language, is not one of the greatest philosophers. But Baba Afsan, Nasr Khosrow, Mir Damad, and so on and so on. Even Ibn Sina composed some poems in both Persian and Arabic. But you had this privileged possibility of expressing philosophy in poetry. However, you have to be careful. You have two very different types of poetry which have a philosophical content. One are poems which are written to explain philosophical principles, to make it easier to memorize, you might say. And they really, we call them nadm rather than shi'r. That is, they're really rhyme rather than real poetry. They're not a great work of art, poetically speaking. The most famous example of that, of course, is in Persia, where in the 19th century, the great philosopher from Khurasan, Sabzawari, wrote a number of poems outlining the principles of philosophy, the difficult poems. And then it was so difficult, he wrote a commentary upon it himself. And the commentary was so difficult, he wrote a gloss upon his own commentary. It's called Sharh al-Manduma, the commentary upon the composed poetry. And it includes the text of Sabzawari, his own commentary, and his own glosses, Hawashi, on his own commentary and the text. And the poems actually are not poetically of high quality. Inna al-wujuda indana asilu, dalil man khalafana alilu. I memorized many of them myself when I was studying Islamic philosophy, but this is not really good poetry. But nevertheless, it helps you to memorize a certain principle. So this was one. The second was very different. It was one philosophical ideas were expressed in beautiful poetic language. So really metaphysical works in poetry. The supreme example of that is the Gulshan Raz of Sheikh Mahmud Shabastari. These were written almost completely by Sufis who had philosophical inclination, not by the technical philosophers. The technical philosophers like Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra also wrote poems, but there's no great poetry. The great exception is, as I said, Nasr Khosrow. But you have these poems of Sufis who are also philosophical Sufis. And the supreme example of that, for me at least, is this text, The Secret Rose Garden of Divine Mysteries, Gulshan Raz, which I've been living with all my life. I've taught it several times over a several-year period to students in a traditional manner, both in Persia and in America. And now I'm just, right now, I did that with a commentary, my own commentary in English, and it's going to come out very soon. The very first work published in English, in which you have a classical Sufi text with a traditional commentary, but in the English language rather than Persian. It's all finished. I'm working on the, correcting things, and by next year I hope it will be out. Anyway, let me conclude. I've taken a lot of your time. I was very pleased to be able to be with you. Nothing to see. Khan Shiraz Najat, that's really amazing. Anyway, I pray for all of you that there's difficult times to remain safe. I pray for the people of India, and I hope that what you're doing in Ahmedabad University will send roots, and there's nothing more important for the future of India, of Asia, of humanity, than studying the truth seriously and to pay attention to the great philosophical traditions of the various sections of the human collectivity. I don't say human race because we have more than one race, the human collectivity, each of which has produced really like a flower garden, different types of beautiful flowers from which we can now all benefit in this age of communication across boundaries. Goodbye. Khudafis to all of you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Nasr. I think there are a lot of questions still in the audience unanswered. I'm really sorry to those who unfortunately could not speak. Amy, would you want to very quickly say something? Yeah, I think you can unmute now. Amy, would you want to say something very quickly? I think you can unmute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Salam arz mikonam. I'm so happy that you still remember me, Professor Nasr. It's great pleasure that you remember me.
I never expected to see your face in India. How are you?
Yes, I'm خیلی ممنون متشکرم. اینجا هنوز ادامه تحصیل در همون رشته‌ای که بودم و دارم بیشتر رو زبان پالی و اینا کار میکنم. ولی خیلی خوشحال شدم. I'm so happy to see you after a long time. Very nice. Very happy.
Good luck to you.
All right. Well, as much as we would like to continue, but
thank you very
much. It's unfortunate, but I guess that's all the time that we have now in this webinar. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you once again, Professor Nasr, for having been here. Thank you very much, and we hope we will see you at the next lecture. And now I would just very briefly like to bring in Hardi for a final vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Saxena. I would like to thank our distinguished guest, Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr, for this wonderful talk and for kindly taking his time out and accepting our invitation. I'm sure you will all agree that this was an extremely captivating and a memorable talk. Thank you also to our audience for joining not only from India, but also from different parts of the world. Finally, I would also like to thank our professors and our administrative team for organizing this lecture. We hope we will see you all at the next lecture organized by Ahmedabad University. So
right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.